The central character of Honey Lee's Girl, Michelle Monell, is orphaned at an early age. Not so early, however, that she doesn't remember her parents. In the following passage, she takes a look at a particularly poignant moment in her childhood. By the time of my 8th birthday, I had become taller than my mother, who could hit 5 feet only with a dainty jump. Actually, though she might have laughed at the word dainty, she did have about her a great deal of lightness, a sort of feminine ghostliness. With her hair regularly washed and shiny, her fingernails regularly polished a pale pink, and with her speech infinitely correct and precise, she struck no one as a typical factory worker. Yet she loved tools, and those well-manicured hands, pushers and pullers, she always said of them, had never failed to resolve the stubbornness in many a mechanical thing. Small, of course, very strong, she always wore leather wristbands and kept the hair out of her eyes with a braided leather cord. I think of her voice as soft, if only because I have no memory of her ever shouting, not at my dad, who rolled money-making schemes at her like a bowler on a hot streak, nor at me, a good kid, both obedient and alone most of the time. I never got into trouble. My mother wore nothing on her feet except soft cloth slippers or a pair of very worn and thin moccasins. Mostly, she said, her work nearly always had about it some aspect of danger, of risk, so she wanted always to feel the floor beneath her, flat and solid. At home, she went barefoot summer and winter. Just a hippie chick, she joked with my father. And other times she told me how we could lose our planet at almost any time, and she'd want to know at the instant it happened, the very moment it slipped away from beneath her feet. That might sound a bit goofy, but Delbert and Mary Winifred Monell wouldn't have known goofy had it come to them in a cartoon. If they had a need to slap down those kinds of whole-earth predictions, that need came from church. They were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they knew almost everything about the end of the world. Some months before that day when my life changed, I discovered my mother's wedding dress. That she even had one came as a shock, because they'd laid the ways of their loose youth on me with both great humor and great frequency. As seems to happen with a lot of people, they'd run their youth on a plane of high sin and low repentance until they stopped, with the stopping having about it all the subtlety of finding a horse in the glove compartment of your car. My folks found Jesus, and he found them. An experience, my mother said, about like going from riding a rapids in a rubber boat to playing bridge with your grandparents. Not unwelcome, and very different. Ribald kids, she told me one time. That's what we were. When I asked her what ribald meant, she just winked at me and gave a quick wiggle to her fanny. As many young mothers will do, even those who see themselves as being brought out of sin into eternal decency, she wanted her child to see her as daring and unconventional, a willing scamp ready to jazz up the world, maybe a notch or two. As any child will do, I wanted her normal and extremely average. The wedding dress told me she'd looked into decency, and the relationship with the Jehovah's that came about some years later confirmed that she'd sealed the deal. My mother and father swore their troth somewhere in Indiana in what is now a soybean field. Intrigued, I had several times hidden myself in the long closet that ran beneath the eaves of our house, the plastic bag holding the dress stiff and crinkly, very noisy to manipulate, so I'd press my body over it as I slowly worked the bag off the dress. With only one light in the closet, and that down near the door, I could feel more than see the dress, a silky thing with a pearlish beading. Alençon lace, I found out before the gown was thrown away, caviar beading, a cathedral train. Convention had clearly called, though I've always wondered if my mother wore shoes at her wedding. I could smell it, too, a real essence of my mother there, but also a whole garden of fanciful imaginings. Wedding wine and an elaborate dinner, cigarette smoke, and always the pungent hint of marijuana. My father, sweaty in the July ceremony, all those hands that would have touched the bride, all the grave or amused huggings and kissings. I even imagined the dress stained with tears, random waters from family and friends I never got to know. Beset by yet another siege of weariness on that particular day, that day or morning of consequence, they told me they were going to take a nap and would I please keep the noise to a minimum. They had by this time both stopped working. Their church had made them believe their bodies would mend, that all those poisons from all those workplaces where tolerances had been pushed just a little would flush themselves away so that Delbert and Mary Winifred Monell could move from a gray-yellow pallor to a blushing pink, courtesy of the Lord. My father, only a bit taller than my mother, stood gaunt but cheerful. They had a friendly rivalry where he said he'd make it up to 100 pounds before she could get to 85. I simply thought of them as small, the kind of people others always referred to as feisty. Later, I walked into their bedroom wearing my mother's wedding dress. I didn't want to wake them because I knew their illnesses were rude masters, rarely obedient to the occasional upbeat mood, but I also felt excited because the dress fit me perfectly. I had tapped into beauty then, a girlish loveliness the medicine I would offer. Humming softly, I danced. Stopping once, I raised the window shades to let the brilliance of an afternoon sun shine through. My hair at the time nearly reached my butt, and I whispered to them that I had sprinkled flecks of gold into it. I danced on and on, never falling, that dress whirling and pushing the stale air around in their tiny bedroom. I danced as they slept. I imagined myself a most ravishing dream, something they would wake from and rub their eyes and scratch their heads, the sleepy mind having found something nameless and exquisite. I danced until I wore myself out and finally left their room, happy that I hadn't disturbed their needed sleep, and disappointed for the same reason. That night, when the visiting nurse came, I sat in the living room while she talked to them in the language of grown-up privacies, the wedding dress still on with the long train of the dress draped neatly over the back and side cushions of the couch. The nurse came out of the bedroom finally and told me I looked wonderful, then told me a short time later that I needed to put some other clothes on because I was going to stay at her house that night, just the one night. When I asked her if that would be all right with my parents, she said she knew they wouldn't mind. They had been dead since early that morning, though months would pass before anyone told me that.